The priest's voice felt like a distant roar. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was the nurse hired to care for the bride, not to take her place. But as Alexander Cross, the most powerful CEO in America, slipped the diamond ring onto my finger, I realized the mistake had gone too far. He thought he was marrying an heiress. He had no idea he just made a poor nurse his wife, or that my secret identity would shatter his world before our wedding night was over. Tell me which country you're watching from. Your messages always make my day. And if you're not subscribed yet, join us. There's so much more coming. Now let's continue. Let me go back to the beginning, to the moment I stopped being Lily Hayes and became someone else's nightmare. It started 5 days earlier in Chicago, at the General Hospital where I worked the overnight trauma shift. It was 2 in the morning, and I was running on my 4th cup of terrible break room coffee. I was stitching up a teenager who swore he didn't start the fight. My hands steady even though I'd been on my feet for 11 hours. I was 26 years old, surviving on coffee and hope that my mother's medical bills wouldn't bury us. Gary, Indiana wasn't far from Chicago, but it felt like another world. My world was small. A rented room near the hospital, scrubs washed in the bathroom sink, and a mother whose smile I hadn't seen since the terminal diagnosis 6 months ago. Stage 4 lung cancer, and she'd never smoked a day in her life. The treatments were experimental, expensive, the kind insurance denies without hesitation. My nursing salary barely covered rent, and the medical bills kept piling up. I'd picked up every extra shift possible, working until my supervisor warned me about burnout. I kept ignoring her because what else could I do? That night after the teenager left, I was cleaning up when I saw her. A woman in a Chanel suit standing in the hallway, mid-50s with blonde hair pulled painfully tight. She wore pearls that cost more than my car, and looked at me with calculated desperation. "Nurse Hayes," she said, reading my name tag. "I need to speak with you privately." I almost said no, but something in her voice made me pause. I led her to an empty consultation room. She sat without invitation. I stayed standing. "What's this about?" I asked. She pulled out medical records that weren't hers from her designer purse. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, and her daughter Vanessa was getting married in 3 days. But Vanessa had a problem. She was fragile, prone to anxiety, needed someone to keep her calm. She was lying, and I could tell, but the medical records were real. So I asked the obvious question that she was clearly waiting for. "Why me?" Margaret smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression at all. "Because you're desperate, Miss Hayes, and I've done my research on you. Your mother is dying. You're drowning in debt. You're exactly the kind of person who says yes when offered enough money." I should have thrown her out right then, should have told her I wasn't for sale. But then she slid a check across the table made out to cash. $50,000, enough to cover 6 months of my mother's experimental treatment. Enough to keep the collection agencies quiet. Enough to make me consider something I knew was morally wrong. "It's just 3 days," Margaret said in a tone that suggested this was perfectly reasonable. "You stay with Vanessa at the estate in Lake Forest. You keep her calm. You make sure she walks down that aisle. Then you leave and this conversation never happened." I stared at the check and saw 6 months of my mother's life written in ink. I'd worked 80-hour weeks for years and never seen that much money at once. "What happens after the wedding?" I asked. "That's not your concern," Margaret said smoothly. "You do your job. You get paid, you disappear back to your little life." I took the check and may God forgive me because I'm not sure I can forgive myself. I told myself it was just nursing, just taking care of someone who needed medical support. I didn't know then that Margaret Whitmore was the most accomplished liar I'd ever meet. Or that her daughter's problem wasn't anxiety but hatred for her fiancé and plans to run away. 2 days later, I drove to Lake Forest in my beat-up Honda Civic. The neighborhood was all mansions, the Cross Estate set on 10 acres overlooking Lake Michigan. A French chateau dropped into Illinois, stone and tall windows and intimidating. A butler led me through white rooms that smelled like money. I was shown to a guest suite bigger than my apartment. Shortly turned into 2 hours of me sitting on an expensive bed in my Target sweater feeling like an imposter. Finally, Vanessa walked in with champagne at 11 in the morning. "You must be the babysitter," she said with entitled contempt. "I'm Lily," I said, standing up and trying to sound professional. "Your mother hired me to help with any medical needs during the wedding." Vanessa laughed, and it was a brittle, bitter sound that made me flinch. "Medical needs? Is that what she told you?" She drank the entire glass of champagne in one swallow like it was water. "Let me guess," she continued, setting the empty glass down hard enough that I worried it would shatter. "She showed you my panic disorder file and made you think I was some fragile flower." I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there like an idiot. Vanessa sat down on the bed, suddenly looking younger than her 24 years. "I don't have panic attacks," she said quietly, all the bravado draining from her voice. "I mean, I do now because my parents sold me to Alexander Cross to save our family business. But the medical records, those are real enough, just not the reason she actually hired you." "What is the reason?" I asked. Vanessa looked at me with something like pity mixed with resignation. "You'll find out soon enough. Just know that whatever she's paying you, it's not nearly enough for what she's planning." I wanted to press her, to demand answers. But before I could say anything, Margaret appeared in the doorway like she'd been listening the whole time. "Vanessa, darling, we have the final dress fitting," she said with false sweetness. She looked at me with cold calculation. "Miss Hayes, please make yourself useful and check Vanessa's blood pressure or whatever it is you nurses do." The next day and a half were strange in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I followed Vanessa through wedding preparations like a shadow that no one acknowledged. Fittings and flower arrangements and seating charts for people with more money than kindness. Vanessa went through the motions with the enthusiasm of someone being led to their own execution. And every time I tried to talk to her privately, Margaret appeared like she had cameras monitoring every room. Which she probably did. The night before the wedding, Vanessa finally cornered me in the guest wing when Margaret was occupied elsewhere. "We need to talk," she said urgently. "Now, before my mother comes back." We went to her room, a massive suite overlooking the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. She locked the door behind us and turned to face me with determination in her eyes. "Tomorrow morning I'm leaving," she said simply. "What?" "I'm not marrying Alexander Cross. I'm in love with someone else and we're running away together." "His name is Marcus. He's my tennis instructor." I felt my stomach drop as I realized what this meant for me. "Your mother, the wedding, all those guests," I stammered. "She figure it out," Vanessa said with a shrug like it was someone else's problem. "She always does. That's why she hired you as insurance." "I don't understand," I said, even though I was starting to. Vanessa smiled, but there was no humor in it at all. "You will," she said. "My mother doesn't lose, Miss Hayes. She do whatever it takes to make sure this wedding happens. Even if I'm not the one standing at the altar." Before I could process that, before I could demand to know exactly what she meant, Vanessa's phone buzzed. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen before. "Marcus is here, I have to go." "Wait," I said desperately. "You can't just leave me here to deal with this." "Watch me," she said, grabbing a packed bag from her closet. "Tell my mother I said goodbye or I don't really care anymore." And she was gone, slipping out through a side door like she'd planned this escape route for months. I stood in her empty room with my heart racing and my mind trying to catch up. I should call Margaret immediately and tell her what happened. But something made me hesitate, Vanessa's words echoing in my head. "As insurance, you'll be at the altar." I walked to the closet where the wedding dress hung like a ghost. A custom Vera Wang worth more than a house, beautiful and terrifying. And I understood exactly what Margaret had planned from the beginning. She'd hired me as a backup plan. Someone desperate enough to do anything for money. Someone the same height as her daughter. Someone who could wear that dress if Vanessa ran. I was still standing there staring at it when Margaret found me an hour later. "Where is she?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut. I told her the truth because lying seemed pointless now. "Gone, with her tennis instructor. She left about an hour ago." Margaret's face went white, then red, then settled into a terrifyingly calm expression. She closed the door and sat down on Vanessa's bed. She looked at me like I was a problem she was about to solve with ruthless efficiency. "Here's what's going to happen," she said in a voice that allowed no argument. "Tomorrow morning you're going to put on that dress, you're going to wear the veil, and you're going to marry Alexander Cross." I laughed because the alternative was screaming. It was a shocked, disbelieving sound. "You're insane." "I'm practical," Margaret corrected without emotion. "This wedding has 200 guests and has been planned for 8 months at enormous expense. If it doesn't happen, the merger between our companies falls apart and my husband loses everything. I can't let that happen because of my daughter's selfishness." "I'm not marrying a stranger," I said, trying to sound firm. "You are if you want the money for your mother," Margaret replied. "And if you don't, I'll make sure she loses her spot in the treatment program immediately. I'll personally see to it that every hospital in LA knows you're unreliable and you'll never work again." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You can't do that. Try me," she said with absolute certainty. "I have connections you can't imagine and power you don't understand." My hands were shaking as the full weight of what she was threatening settled on me. This was extortion, insane and illegal and morally reprehensible. But I thought about my mother, about the treatments that were finally giving us hope. About losing her because I had the luxury of a conscience. "How," I whispered. "How would this even work, he'll know." Margaret stood up, suddenly businesslike and efficient. "The ceremony is private. Just immediate family and the efficient. No 200 guests for the actual vows. Alexander has never met Vanessa in person. This entire engagement has been conducted through lawyers and contracts. You're the same height, same build. The veil is heavy enough to completely hide your face. You say the words. You sign the papers with Vanessa's name. Then you disappear. We'll say you got sick and needed rest. By the time anyone realizes the truth, you'll be long gone." "And Alexander," I asked. "What happens when he eventually finds out?" "He won't," Margaret said with absolute confidence. "This is a business transaction to him. He doesn't care who the bride is. You wear the dress for an hour, you take my money, you save your mother, everyone wins. "Except me," I said. "Except my conscience and my integrity and everything I thought I believed in." Margaret's expression hardened into something cruel. "Then think about this," she said. "Your mother has 3 months to live without treatment, maybe less if she's unlucky. Are you really going to let her die because you're too proud to pretend to be my daughter for 60 minutes? She was right, and that's what made it so horrible. She was absolutely, devastatingly right. I closed my eyes and thought about my mother's face the last time I'd visited. How small she looked in that hospital bed. How she'd still asked if I was eating enough. Still being my mother even when she could barely breathe. I opened my eyes. 1 hour, I said. Just the ceremony, and then I leave immediately. Margaret smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who always got exactly what she wanted. 1 hour, she agreed. But you'll do it perfectly. You'll be Vanessa Whitmore with no hesitation and no mistakes, or the deal is off and I destroy you. I nodded, feeling numb. Good, Margaret said. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow you're getting married. I didn't sleep. How could I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong? What if Alexander spoke to me? What if someone recognized I wasn't Vanessa? What if I couldn't go through with it? But every time I thought about backing out, I saw my mother's face. And I knew I'd already made my choice the moment I took that check. Morning came too fast, bringing with it a reality I wasn't ready to face. Margaret appeared at dawn with a team of stylists who descended on me like I was a project to complete. They did my hair in an elaborate updo, painted my face until I looked like a stranger. They laced me into the dress, a mountain of white silk and crystals that weighed more than it should. Then came the veil, heavy lace that fell to my waist and obscured my face completely. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Good, Margaret said with satisfaction. You look perfect. Just remember to be quiet and demure. Let Alexander think you're shy. The wedding was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Private and intimate by design. I stood in an anteroom off the chapel, shaking so hard I thought my legs would give out. I could hear voices on the other side of the door, the officiant and Margaret and her husband. And him, Alexander Cross, the man I was about to marry under the worst kind of lie. I'd seen pictures, of course. Every business magazine in America had featured him at some point. The youngest self-made billionaire, the man who'd built an empire from nothing. But pictures didn't prepare you for the reality. The doors opened and music started, some classical piece I didn't recognize. I was walking down an aisle lined with white roses, my bouquet trembling in my hands. I kept my eyes down like a shy bride, but I could feel him watching me. Feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing. When I finally looked up, I forgot how to breathe. Alexander Cross was 32 years old and looked like ambition carved into human form. Tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair swept back from a face of sharp angles and focused intensity. He wore a black suit that was obviously custom, perfectly tailored to broad shoulders. But it was his eyes that stopped me completely. Gray, the color of winter sky over Lake Michigan, and intelligent in a way that made me feel exposed. I reached the altar and he held out his hand. I took it and his skin was warm, calloused, not the soft hands of someone who'd never worked. That surprised me more than it should have. The officiant started speaking, and I barely heard the words. I was too focused on not fainting, on keeping my hands steady in Alexander's, on remembering to breathe. Then came the vows, and I had to repeat after the officiant. My voice came out barely above a whisper. I, Vanessa Whitmore, felt sick saying her name instead of my own. Take thee, Alexander Cross, to be my lawfully wedded husband. Each word felt like a lie burning my tongue. But I said them, all of them, every terrible word. Alexander's turn came, and his voice was deeper than I'd expected. Steady and confident like everything else about him. But when he said Vanessa's name, something flickered across his face. Doubt maybe, or disappointment. Then he looked down at our joined hands and paused. The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. The officiant cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Cross. Alexander's thumb brushed across my wrist, across the calluses I'd earned from years of nursing. From washing my hands 100 times a shift. From 4 insertions and compressions and all the small violences of saving lives. His eyes met mine through the veil. And I knew somehow that he'd felt the difference. But he continued with the vows. To be my lawfully wedded wife. Relief and terror hit me in equal measure. The ring came next, and he slid it onto my finger. A diamond so large it felt obscene on my hand. I slid a platinum band onto his with trembling fingers. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the officiant said. You may kiss the bride. Panic seized me because Margaret hadn't mentioned this part. Alexander lifted the veil slowly, and for the first time we looked at each other without any barrier. His expression was unreadable, controlled, but something in those gray eyes made me think of a predator studying prey. He leaned in and I held my breath, and he kissed me. It was brief and chaste, the kiss of a man fulfilling an obligation. But his lips were soft, and for just a second his hand came up to cut my cheek. Gentle, almost protective in a way I didn't expect. Then he pulled back. It's done, he said quietly. Margaret appeared immediately, like she'd been waiting just off stage. You must be exhausted, darling, she said to me with sugary false concern. Why don't you go rest while we handle the paperwork? I nodded, desperate for any excuse to escape this moment. But as I turned to leave, Alexander spoke. My wife will stay, he said firmly. We'll handle the paperwork together. I froze and Margaret's smile tightened at the edges. Of course, how thoughtful. The next 20 minutes were torture in slow motion. Signing documents while Alexander signed across from me, our signatures side by side. Legal and binding and terrifyingly real. I signed Vanessa's name in handwriting I'd practiced all night. He signed his own in a bold, confident scrawl. Done, the lawyer said with finality. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Cross. I thought that was it, that I'd fulfilled my part of this nightmare. I'd wear this dress back to my room, change into my own clothes, and disappear like Margaret promised. But then Alexander turned to me. We need to leave for New York, he said like this was obvious. What? The honeymoon, he continued. We have a flight in 2 hours, and my penthouse in Manhattan is ready. I looked at Margaret with panic screaming in my head. She looked back with warning in her eyes. How lovely, she said. I'm sure Vanessa is thrilled. Aren't you, darling? I couldn't speak, couldn't argue without revealing everything. So I nodded like the coward I was. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly like he'd noticed my hesitation. But he just said good and walked toward the door. Let's go. The next hour was chaos that I barely processed. Margaret pulled me aside while Alexander made phone calls. You have to go with him, she hissed, gripping my arm hard enough to bruise. If you don't, He'll know something's wrong and everything falls apart. But you said 1 hour. I whispered back desperately. Plans change, she said coldly. Go to New York, play the role for one night. Tomorrow you can claim you're sick and fly home. I'll double your fee. One night, I said. That's it, and then I'm done with this. Margaret nodded, but I didn't believe her anymore. One night, I swear. I didn't have a choice. I was already trapped. Already married to a man who thought I was someone else. I changed out of the wedding dress into clothes Vanessa had left behind. Designer jeans and a cashmere sweater. Everything too expensive, but fitting perfectly because we were the same size. I caught sight of myself in the mirror. I looked like a different person, wealthy and polished, nothing like the exhausted nurse who'd put on scrubs 5 days ago. A black car waited outside, and Alexander was already inside. He was on his phone talking in clipped tones about markets and projections. I slid in beside him and the door closed. We were alone. He ended his call and looked at me, really looked at me. You're quiet, he said. I'm tired, I managed to say. It's been a long morning. He nodded like that made sense. Understandable, we'll be in the air soon and you can sleep on the plane. The drive to the private airfield took 40 minutes. I spent every second trying not to hyperventilate. This was insane. Getting on a plane with a man who thought he'd married someone else. Going to New York, to his penthouse, for a wedding night I couldn't go through with. I needed a plan, a way out, but my mind was blank with panic. We arrived at a small airport I didn't know existed. Private jets lined the runway like toys for people with too much money. Alexander's was sleek and white and probably cost more than a hospital wing. We boarded and the interior was all leather and soft lighting, luxury I'd only seen in magazines. A flight attendant offered champagne and I took a glass to have something to hold. Alexander took water. We sat across from each other as the jet taxied down the runway. He was still on his phone, messaging someone. I stared out the window watching Chicago fall away beneath us. Lake Michigan and the skyline, everything familiar disappearing as we climbed into winter clouds. I felt the weight of what I'd done settling onto my chest like stones. I was trapped at 30,000 feet with no way out and no idea what came next. The flight attendant came by again. Would either of you like lunch? Alexander shook his head without looking up. I realized I hadn't eaten since yesterday, but my stomach was too knotted to consider food. No thank you, I said, and my voice came out rough. The attendant left and Alexander set down his phone. He looked at me with an intensity that made me want to disappear. You should eat something, he said. You've barely touched the champagne. I'm fine. You look pale. I'm fine, I repeated more firmly. He studied me for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small prescription bottle. I watched him shake 2 pills into his palm and swallow them dry. His hand trembled just slightly. My nursing instincts overrode my common sense. What are those for? I asked before I could stop myself. He froze and his gray eyes locked on mine. Nothing that concerns you, he said, but his voice was tight, defensive. I recognized that tone from patients hiding something serious. Pretending everything was fine when it absolutely wasn't. I should have backed off, should have remembered I was supposed to be Vanessa. But I'd spent too many years in hospitals watching people suffer, because they were too proud to ask for help. Those are prescription, I said. What are they for? Alexander's jaw tightened. Why do you care? He asked. Because you just took them without water, because your hand was shaking. Because I'm your wife now and I'd like to know if something's wrong. For a second, I thought he might actually tell me. Something shifted in his expression, softened. But then it was gone, replaced by cold control. I'm fine, he said. Just vitamins. Now if you'll excuse me, I've work to do. He opened his laptop and became a wall. I sat back, frustrated and worried in equal measure. This man was clearly dealing with something medical. And clearly too stubborn to admit it, which made him both infuriating and familiar. I'd known people like him. People who pushed through pain until their bodies forced them to stop. I just hoped whatever he was hiding wouldn't force him to stop while we were alone on this jet. 30 minutes passed in tense silence. Alexander worked and I pretended to look at a magazine. But I was watching him, noticing small things. The way he shifted his weight every few minutes. The way he pressed his hand to his chest briefly before going back to typing. The way his breathing seemed slightly off. Too controlled. Like he was concentrating on it. Then it happened. His breath hitched, audible and sharp. He stopped typing and his hand went to his chest and stayed there. I sat up straighter. Are you okay? He didn't answer and his face had gone pale. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Alexander, I said more urgently. He waved me off with his free hand, but the gesture was weak. I'm fine, just... He couldn't finish the sentence. His breathing was coming too fast now. Shallow and labored. I saw panic flash in his eyes. The kind of panic that comes when your body betrays you and you can't control it. I didn't wait for permission. I crossed to his seat and knelt beside him. Talk to me, I said firmly. What's happening? Can't breathe, he managed. His voice was strained and terrified. I grabbed his wrist to check his pulse. Too fast, too irregular. I looked around the cabin. Do you have an emergency medical kit on this plane? I demanded of the flight attendant, who appeared looking terrified. She pointed to a compartment near the cockpit. I ran for it and yanked it open. The kit was basic, oxygen and blood pressure cuff, not enough for a real emergency. But it would have to do. I grabbed what I needed and returned to Alexander. He was leaning forward now, gasping, his tie loosened and collar unbuttoned. I put an oxygen mask over his face. Breathe slowly, I told him. In through your nose, out through your mouth. He tried to push the mask away. I held it firm against his face. Stop fighting me, I said. You're having some kind of allergic reaction or respiratory crisis and I need you to let me help. Do you understand? He stared at me through the clear plastic and nodded. I could see the fear in his eyes but also trust. He was letting me take control, letting a stranger save his life. I checked his blood pressure. High, dangerously high. Do you have a history of heart problems? I asked. He shook his head. Allergies. He hesitated, then nodded. What kind? I demanded. Shellfish, he whispered through the mask. My stomach dropped. Did you eat anything this morning at the reception? His eyes widened. Appetizers. Someone had served shrimp and he hadn't thought twice about it. Of course he hadn't. This wedding was a business transaction to him. I cursed under my breath. This wasn't a heart attack, it was anaphylaxis. And we were 30,000 feet in the air with no EpiPen in this inadequate kit. I had to improvise with what I had. I elevated his legs with pillows from the other seats. I kept the oxygen flowing at maximum. I monitored his vitals every 30 seconds, talking to him the entire time to keep him conscious and calm. "You're going to be fine," I said. "Your body is fighting something it doesn't like, but we're going to get through this together. The reaction is peaking now. It should start subsiding soon. Just stay with me and keep breathing, nice and slow." He stared at me through the mask, those gray eyes searching mine, trying to understand who I was. Because Vanessa Whitmore wouldn't know how to do this. Wouldn't have medical training or speak with the calm authority of someone who'd run codes in trauma bays. I saw the exact moment he registered that something was very wrong with this picture. "Who are you?" he tried to say through the mask. But his voice was too weak. I pretended not to hear. Just focused on keeping him alive, on watching the monitor, on praying his body would fight off the reaction. 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. But slowly, gradually, his breathing started to even out. The wheezing decreased and color returned to his face. His heart rate dropped back toward something resembling normal. I kept the oxygen on him for 20 more minutes just to be safe. When I finally removed the mask, he was exhausted but stable. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Gratitude and confusion and suspicion all mixed together. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I was doing my job," I replied before I could stop myself. His eyebrows rose. "Your job." I froze, realizing what I'd just said. "I meant as your wife," I stammered. "Taking care of you, that's what spouses do." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Vanessa doesn't know anything about medicine. She faints at the sight of blood. So I'll ask you again, who are you?" The cabin felt too small, too quiet. I could lie, make up something, but I was so tired of lying, and he'd almost died. I looked down at my hands. The hands that had saved him. Hands with calluses and short nails and tiny scars from needle sticks. Hands that told the truth even when my words wouldn't. I opened my mouth to confess everything. To tell him I was nobody. A nurse from Gary, Indiana, who'd been paid to stand in for a runaway bride. But the jet hit turbulence, violent and sudden. I stumbled backward into the opposite seat. Alarms sounded and the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, asking everyone to buckle in. The moment shattered. Alexander closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him. "We'd deal with this later," when he woke, when we landed. I buckled myself in and watched him sleep, knowing that when he opened his eyes again, everything would fall apart. But for now, all I could do was make sure he kept breathing. We landed at Teterboro Airport just after midnight. Alexander woke as the wheels touched down, groggy but stable. He looked at me and I looked back. Neither of us spoke about what had happened on the jet, about the questions he'd asked that I hadn't answered. We just gathered our things and deplaned in heavy silence. A black car waited on the tarmac. Alexander's driver, a man named Thomas who didn't ask questions or make small talk. We drove through New Jersey, across the George Washington Bridge, and into Manhattan. The city glittered like fallen stars. Buildings so tall, they seemed to hold up the sky. I'd never been to New York, and I pressed my face to the window, momentarily forgetting to be scared. We pulled up to a building on Fifth Avenue. The kind with a doorman in a lobby made of marble and gold leaf. The doorman greeted Alexander by name, welcomed him home, and congratulated him on the wedding. Alexander nodded his thanks and led me to a private elevator. The ride up was suffocating. He stood on one side and I stood on the other. The air between us felt electric with unspoken words. The elevator opened directly into his penthouse. I stepped into a space that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Minimalist furniture in shades of white and gray. Everything expensive and everything cold. Beautiful in the way a museum is beautiful. Empty in the same way too. Alexander walked to a bar cart and poured whiskey into a crystal glass. He downed it in one swallow, poured another. I stood in the center of the room, still in Vanessa's clothes. Still wearing Vanessa's life, feeling like an actress who'd forgotten her lines. "We need to talk," Alexander said finally. His voice was quiet and controlled, but I heard steel underneath. "I know," I said. "Good." He gestured to a white sofa. "Sit." I sat and he didn't. He stayed at the bar with the glass in his hand, watching me like I was evidence in a case he was building. "Tell me your name," he said. "Your real name." For a second I considered lying, doubling down, insisting I was Vanessa. But what was the point? He already knew. I reached up and pulled the pins from my hair, let it fall from the elegant updo, shook it out until I looked more like myself. "My name is Lily Hayes," I said quietly. "I'm a nurse at Chicago General Hospital. I was hired to take care of Vanessa before the wedding, but she ran away this morning. Her family paid me to take her place." There it was, the truth. It sat between us like a bomb waiting to explode. Alexander didn't move, didn't react. He just took another sip of whiskey. "How much?" he asked. "What? How much did they pay you to marry me?" $50,000. He laughed, and it was a harsh, bitter sound. 50,000. That's what the Whitmores think my marriage is worth. $50,000 and a desperate nurse who needed the money badly enough to commit fraud. I flinched. "It wasn't like that, wasn't it?" he asked. "You stood at an altar and lied. You spoke vows that weren't yours. You signed a legal document with someone else's name. What would you call that?" "Survival," I said. "My mother is dying. She has stage 4 lung cancer and the treatments are experimental. My insurance won't cover them and I was drowning in medical bills. I was working triple shifts and it still wasn't enough. Margaret Whitmore found me at my weakest moment and offered me a way out. I took it, not because I wanted to hurt you, because I wanted to save my mother. Can you understand that?" He set the glass down hard enough that I heard it crack. "I understand that you're a liar," he said, "and that everything about today was built on deception. I understand that the woman I married doesn't exist. What I don't understand is why you saved my life on that plane. If this was just a job, just money, why not let me die and collect your fee from the estate?" "Because I'm a nurse," I said, standing up. "Because that's who I am under all the lies. I've spent the last 4 years of my life learning how to save people. It's not something I can turn off. I saw you struggling to breathe and every instinct I have kicked in. I didn't think about the money or the lie or anything except keeping you alive. That's the truth." He stared at me. And for the first time since landing, I saw something other than anger in his eyes. Confusion, maybe even a hint of respect. "I knew," he said finally. "I knew you weren't Vanessa the moment I saw your hands." I blinked. "What?" "Your hands," he repeated, walking closer. "Vanessa has manicured nails and soft skin, hands that have never worked a day in her life. You have calluses and short nails, small scars on your knuckles, hands that know what labor means. I noticed when I put the ring on your finger. And when you saved my life on that plane, I knew for certain. Vanessa Whitmore wouldn't know how to check blood pressure. Wouldn't know how to manage anaphylaxis. Wouldn't care enough to try. My breath caught. You knew, I whispered. And you didn't say anything at the altar, on the plane. You knew the whole time. He nodded. Why? I asked. Why would you go through with a marriage you knew was fake? He was quiet for a long time. Then he walked to the window, staring out at Central Park far below. Because for the first time in my life, someone looked at me and saw a person, he said slowly. Not a bank account, not a merger opportunity, not Alexander Cross, the CEO. You saw a man who needed help and you helped him. No calculations, no conditions, just immediate instinctive care. Do you know how rare that is in my world? I didn't know what to say. He turned back to me. I built this empire from nothing, Lily. I grew up in South Boston in a neighborhood where people like the Whitmores wouldn't set foot. My father was a drunk who disappeared when I was 10. My mother cleaned houses 16 hours a day to keep me in school. I clawed my way out of that life. I made myself into someone who couldn't be ignored or dismissed. But along the way, I forgot what it felt like to be seen as human. As someone who could hurt or need help or be vulnerable. And then you knelt beside me on that jet and looked at me like I mattered. Not my money, not my empire, just me. Tears stung my eyes and I blinked them back. So what happens now? I asked. Do you call the police, report the fraud, annul the marriage? He studied me for a long moment. Then he smiled and it was tired but genuine. Now we make a choice, he said. This marriage was built on lies, but it doesn't have to stay that way. I never wanted Vanessa. This wedding was a business transaction to save her family's company. But you're real, you're here. And I think we could turn this disaster into something honest if we wanted to. I stared at him. Are you suggesting we stay married? I'm suggesting we consider it, he replied. No more lies, no more pretending. Just two people who met in the worst possible way trying to figure out if they can build something real. I'll pay off your mother's medical bills regardless of your decision. That's not a condition, that's just decency. But if you stay, I want it to be because you choose to. Not because you're afraid or desperate, because you actually want to try this with me. My mind was reeling. This was insane. I'd known this man for 12 hours. I'd married him under false pretenses and lied about everything. And now he was offering me a chance at something I didn't even know I wanted. But as I looked at him standing there in his expensive suit, vulnerable and honest in a way I suspected he rarely was, I realized something. I didn't want to leave, not yet. Not without seeing where this impossible situation could lead. I have conditions, I said. He raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. I don't stop being a nurse, I said. I worked too hard for that degree to give it up. I won't become some trophy wife who attends charity galas and smiles for cameras. If we do this, we do it as partners, as equals. I keep my career, my identity, my life. And you be honest with me about your health. Whatever you're dealing with, whatever you're hiding, we face it together or not at all. He walked back to where I stood, held out his hand. Deal, he said. Equals, no more secrets. I shook his hand. And for the first time since I'd put on that wedding dress, I felt like I could breathe. We stayed up until sunrise talking, really talking. He told me about Boston, about the father who drank himself to death, about the mother who worked 3 jobs to send him to MIT, about the patent he developed in his dorm room that became the foundation of his company. about building an empire because it was the only way to make sure no one could ever take anything from him again. I told him about Gary, Indiana. About my mother's bakery that smelled like cinnamon and hope until the cancer came. About nursing school and working nights while my friends partied. About the fear that lived in my chest every time a bill came or a doctor used words like palliative and end of life. We were both exhausted and both raw. But somewhere in those early morning hours, the space between us shifted. From strangers to something else. Something fragile but real. When sunlight filled the penthouse, Alexander stood and held out his hand. "Come here," he said. "I'll show you something." I took his hand and he led me through rooms I hadn't seen. Past a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. Past a home office with more screens than I could count. To the master bedroom. I tensed, but Alexander walked past the massive bed to a door I hadn't noticed. He opened it to reveal a closet the size of my apartment. One side was filled with men's suits in shades of gray and black. The other side was completely empty. "This is yours now," he said. "If you want it, we'll get rid of anything Vanessa left. You can fill it with whatever you want. Scrubs if that makes you happy." I laughed. It was a tired, slightly hysterical sound. "You're serious about this?" "Completely," he replied. "No more lies, Lily. We start fresh right now. This is your home if you choose it. Your space. I won't push you for anything you're not ready for. We're married on paper, but we'll figure out the rest as we go." I looked around the massive closet, then back at him. "I have one more condition," I said. "What's that?" he asked. "You see a doctor about that allergy. A real allergist. And you tell me what those pills are really for. No more hiding your health issues. If we're doing this, I need to know you're taking care of yourself." He smiled. "You sound like a nurse." "I am a nurse," I said. "Get used to it." He laughed. A real laugh this time. It transformed his face, made him look younger and more human. "I think I can manage that," he said. "Good," I replied. "Because I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." And just like that, the worst mistake of my life became the beginning of something I never expected. Something terrifying and uncertain and possibly wonderful. The next few weeks were surreal. Alexander kept his word, paying off every cent of my mother's medical bills and arranging her transfer to a private oncology facility near Chicago. He gave me space in the penthouse, a bedroom of my own, no pressure or expectations. I went back to work at Chicago General Hospital, and it felt like returning to solid ground. My supervisor asked if I was okay, and for the first time in months I actually meant it when I said yes. Alexander opened a satellite office in Chicago to stay close. By day I was Lily Hayes, trauma nurse. By night I was Mrs. Alexander Cross, learning to navigate a new world. We had dinner together most evenings, learning each other's rhythms. He was demanding with work but patient with me. I was skeptical of his world, but curious. 3 weeks in, we had our first real fight. I came home from a brutal double shift to find him in his office at 2 in the morning, working despite the exhaustion clear on his face. I told him to go to bed. He told me to stop mothering him. I said that's what happens when you marry a nurse. He said he didn't marry me to be managed. I said then maybe he should have stayed single. The words hung between us like poison. He stared at me and I stared back. Then he stood, crossed the office, and kissed me. It was desperate and angry and everything we'd been holding back since the night we met. When he pulled away, we were both breathing hard. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm not used to someone caring." "Get used to it," I replied. Because I do care. I care more than I should about a man I've known for 3 weeks. And I'm not going to stand by and watch you destroy yourself for your company. He rested his forehead against mine. I'm trying, he whispered. I know, I said. But try harder. He kissed me again, softer this time. And when he carried me to his bedroom, I didn't protest. We crossed the line we'd been dancing around. And everything changed. After that night, we stopped pretending. We were married because we'd chosen each other. It wasn't perfect. We fought about work hours and taking on too many shifts. But we also laughed, talked until sunrise, learned what it meant to build something together. 4 months into our marriage, Vanessa showed up unannounced. Alexander and I were in the kitchen teaching him to make pancakes, both laughing when the door opened. Vanessa stood there in designer clothes and oversized sunglasses. Oh my God, she said. You're still here. I assumed this would have exploded by now. Alexander stepped in front of me. What do you want, Vanessa? His voice was cold enough to frost glass. She walked further into the apartment like she owned it. I want what's mine, she said simply. This marriage, this life. My mother told me you knew about the switch, that you went along with it. But we both know you didn't marry her, Alexander. You married me. The contract says Vanessa Whitmore. I'm Vanessa Whitmore. So let's fix this mistake and move forward. I have lawyers. I felt my stomach drop. She was right about one thing. The original marriage certificate said Vanessa's name. I was legally nobody in this equation. Alexander's jaw tightened. Get out, he said quietly. Or what? Vanessa challenged. You'll call security. Tell them your wife is trespassing. Except I am your wife. On paper, legally. This nurse is nothing. The word nothing hit me like a slap. Alexander's hand found mine and gripped tight. She's everything, he said. And you're a stranger who abandoned a wedding to run away with your tennis instructor. You don't get to walk back in here and claim something you threw away like garbage. Vanessa's confidence faltered. My family will sue you, she said. For breach of contract. For fraud, you'll lose the merger. Alexander smiled, and it was dangerous, almost predatory. Go ahead and try, he said. I'll spend every dollar I have making sure the world knows who you really are. Every society page, every business journal. They'll all know that Vanessa Whitmore is a coward who breaks contracts. See how well that plays in your social circles. See what kind of marriage prospects you have when everyone knows you can't be trusted. Vanessa went pale. You wouldn't. Try me, Alexander said. Now get out of my home before I have security escort you out. She looked at me one last time. You think you won, she said. But you'll never be one of us. You'll always be the poor nurse who got lucky. I stepped forward. You're right, I said calmly. I'll never be one of you, and I thank God for that every single day. She left and the door slammed. I waited until I heard the elevator descend before I let out the breath I'd been holding. Alexander turned to me. Are you okay? He asked. I nodded, then shook my head. She's right about the legal part, I said. The original certificate has her name, if she really sues. He pulled me close. Then we fix it, he said. We get the paperwork corrected and make this legal in every possible way. But Lily, listen to me, you are my wife. Not because of paperwork, but because I choose you. Every single day I choose you. Do you understand? I buried my face against his chest. I choose you too, I whispered. We hired lawyers who filed motions and corrected documents. It took 8 weeks of bureaucracy, but finally it was done. The corrected certificate arrived with my name, Lily Hayes Cross. Alexander framed it and hung it in our office, because by then I'd stopped keeping my two lives separate. I was a nurse and I was his wife. I was both, and I'd stopped apologizing for it. My mother's health continued to improve. The experimental treatment was working better than anyone had hoped. She had good days and bad days, but the good ones were increasing. Alexander flew her to New York once a month so we could have dinner together. She adored him and also saw straight through him. "You're good for each other," she told me one evening after he'd left the room. "He softens you, makes you smile more. And you ground him. Keep him human. Don't let go of that." "I won't," I promised. And I meant it with everything in me. Because somewhere between the lie that started us and the truth we'd built together, I'd fallen completely in love with Alexander Cross. Not the billionaire, not the CEO. The man who brought me terrible coffee he'd made himself at 3 in the morning. The man who'd learned to cook because he wanted to surprise me. The man who sat with my mother and listened to her stories about the bakery like they were the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard. He told me he loved me on a random Tuesday. We were walking through Central Park in October rain, sharing an umbrella that was too small for both of us. We were soaked and both laughing at how ridiculous we looked. He stopped in the middle of the path, took my face in his hands, and said, "I love you, Lily Hayes. I loved you when you saved my life on that plane. I loved you when you yelled at me for working 16-hour days. I loved you this morning when I woke up and you were still there. I love you now, and I'll love you tomorrow. Every tomorrow we get." I kissed him in the rain, not caring who saw. Anne said it back. "I love you too, and I'm so glad I made the worst decision of my life." He laughed against my lips. "Best mistake I ever made." "Mine too," I whispered. 7 months after a wedding that was never supposed to be mine, Alexander and I stood in the same chapel in Lake Forest where it all began. This time there were no lies and no veils hiding my face. No desperate substitutions or terrified compromises. Just him and me and the people who mattered most. My mother in the front row, healthy enough to cry happy tears. A few close friends and his mother who'd flown in from Boston. She hugged me so tight I thought she'd never let go. We renewed our vows the right way this time. With the right names and the right hearts. When Alexander slipped the ring onto my finger for the second time, his hands were steady. And when he kissed me, it wasn't obligation or performance. It was promise. It was forever. The reception was small and intimate. We danced in the same ballroom where I'd once stood terrified and out of place, but this time I belonged. Not because I'd changed who I was, but because I'd found someone who loved me exactly as I was. A nurse from Gary, Indiana who wore scrubs more often than designer dresses. A woman who'd saved her husband's life before she ever loved him. That night we drove to Gary. Just the two of us in his car. Alexander wanted to see where I grew up. I took him to the small house where my mother still lived sometimes. The house I'd almost lost. We sat on the front porch drinking sweet tea, watching October fireflies blink in the dusk. "This is where I learned what home really means," I told him. Not a place, not a building, but a feeling. Of belonging, of being safe enough to be yourself. He took my hand. "You gave me that," he said quietly. "I spent my whole life building things, Lily. Companies and wealth and a reputation, but I never had a home, not until you. Not until I found someone who saw past all of it and decided I was worth staying for anyway." I rested my head on his shoulder. We sat there until the stars came out. Two people who should never have met, who started with lies and built something true. And I knew something with absolute certainty. Sometimes the worst mistakes lead to the best lives. Sometimes the wrong turn puts you exactly where you needed to be all along. 7 months after our real wedding, I'm still a trauma nurse at Chicago General Hospital. I still work nights and still come home exhausted with coffee stains on my scrubs. But now when I walk through the door, Alexander is there. Sometimes working, sometimes cooking something he learned from a YouTube video, sometimes asleep on the couch waiting for me. But always there, and I'm always home. We started a foundation together. Not to build hospitals or monuments, but something more personal. We pay medical bills for families drowning in debt. Quietly and anonymously. We find people like my mother, like the version of me who stood desperate in a hospital hallway. And we give them what Alexander gave me. Not charity, but a chance. A chance to breathe, to hope, to believe that maybe everything will turn out okay. I still think about that morning sometimes. Standing at an altar in a borrowed dress. Marrying a stranger and lying with every breath. I think about how terrified I was. How certain I was that it would all fall apart. But it didn't. That moment of desperate deception became the foundation of the most honest relationship I've ever had. Because Alexander was right. Our marriage was built on a lie, but we chose to turn it into the truest thing either of us had ever known. People ask sometimes how we make it work. A nurse and a billionaire, two people from different universes. I tell them we don't try to change each other. He doesn't ask me to stop being a nurse. I don't ask him to stop building his empire. We just show up every single day. In scrubs or suits or pajamas at midnight. We show up for each other, and somehow that's enough. My mother is in remission now, living near our Chicago apartment, close enough for frequent visits. Alexander brings her flowers every Sunday. They play gin rummy, and she tells embarrassing stories. He listens like she's revealing universal secrets. We still fight about work hours and extra shifts. But we always come back to each other. Always remember we chose this. Last week, Alexander surprised me. He'd been acting strange, secretive in a way that made me nervous. I thought maybe the business was in trouble or his health. But then he took me to Navy Pier, to the spot where we'd had our first real date months after the wedding. The Chicago skyline glittered behind us. Lake Michigan stretched out dark and endless. And he got down on one knee. I laughed. "We're already married," I said. "Twice." "I know," he replied. "But I never got to propose, not really. So let me do this right. Lily Hayes Cross, will you marry me? Again, every day for the rest of our lives. Will you keep showing up in scrubs and terrible coffee breath? Will you keep being exactly who you are while I try to be worthy of that?" I was crying. "Yes," I said. "Yes, always yes." He slipped a new ring onto my finger alongside the first. Not a massive diamond this time, but something simpler. More us. A gold band with words engraved inside. Best mistake I ever made. I kissed him there on Navy Pier, in the city where our impossible story started, and whispered against his lips, "Mine too." The end. We spend so much time trying to make the right choices, to follow the perfect path, to avoid mistakes at all costs. But sometimes it's the detours that save us. Sometimes it's the moment we say yes to the thing that terrifies us that we find exactly what we didn't know we were looking for. Sometimes being lost is just another word for being found in a way you never expected. And maybe that's the most honest truth of all. That life doesn't follow our careful plans. That love doesn't wait for permission. That the person who changes everything might walk into your life on the worst day you've ever had and turn it into the beginning of your best story. So if you're standing at a crossroads right now, if you're terrified of making the wrong choice, remember this. Some mistakes aren't mistakes at all. They're just the universe's way of putting you exactly where you need to be. And maybe, just maybe, your worst decision will become your most beautiful beginning. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it reached your heart, even just a little, do not leave without letting me know. A simple heart in the comments is enough. And if you want to feel more stories like this, stories about love born from impossible choices, about truth that grows from lies, about finding home in the last place you'd ever look, make sure to subscribe to Dramora Stories. Every story here is a reminder that sometimes courage looks like saying yes when everything screams no. That sometimes the person you become by accident is exactly who you were meant to be. That the best chapters of our lives often begin with the words, "This is a terrible idea." Because here's what I've learned, and maybe it's true for you too.